well. So let's get started. I have a few points on the agenda, and normally I use the full hour to show software. But I guess since we are building a terminology database from scratch, we should all have a first a few words about terminology theory and how to structure a terminology entry. I thought that would be a good thing to do, so we will go through that. And then I show you 3 easy ways to create a term base and how to import data into the term base, and then actually also create data records manually. That's also something that I will share. And then we will be using our term base in a translation project and see what we can get during translation from the term base. Okay, so some theory first. A term base. What is a term base? Well, a term base is nothing else but a database that basically stores and manages terms with their various translations into various languages. And when I say various languages, this is something that differentiates a term base from a TM, from a translation memory. A term base can be a multilingual resource, so you can actually manage like 24, 48, or even more languages if you want in one database. The term bases then often integrate with a translation memory system or authoring solutions and allow automatic glossary lookup, or what we call automatic term recognition. So while you translate or while you author a text, you get matches from the terminology database, and it helps you finding the right words when you write a source or a target language text. And since terminology data is structured data, it can also be very well used by other programs, such as machine translation programs, for example. And you can actually use this data very easily to train machine translation engines with it. So a good terminology database is a very good asset also if you look a little bit into the future and what technology you want to use in, let's say, 5 or 6 years. Okay, so what is a term, what is terminology, and what is a term base? Just to separate these 3 terms from each other. Well, a term base entry usually contains a nominative singular version of a term. So a term is a specific word, or in our case, in German, I'm a German, you hear that from my accent. We are famous for our compound terms, so we create word chains basically and use that to create new terms. So this would be a term, and it's usually in the term base as a nominative singular. If you sometimes you have a pluralitantum as well, then it's a word that only appears in the plural form. But if you want to record a plural form with a term, you would rather put it into another metadata field rather than a second term field, because otherwise you would get duplicate search hits when you start searching for something. Besides the pure linguistic information, such as a word form, grammar, or information about a subject field, a term base can also contain classifying metadata, so something that you want to store together with a term or a term and its target term, so that you can remember in 2 years, for example, in which context the term is used. Maybe you want to store a picture. If you do machinery translations a lot, then it's really good to store also pictures with terminology entries, because the picture often says more than a word. So you can also use metadata like that to put along with your term pairs. And then term-based entries are usually concept-oriented. That is, concept-oriented is something that comes from terminology science, actually. And already, if we go back a few thousand years back into the Greek culture, then the philosopher Platon already basically understood that there is actually a difference between the name, so the lexical representation, the idea that we have in our head about a concept, and the tangible thing itself. So there are the three aspects to a word or to a term. And the whole idea of this, what you see in the picture below, is the terminological triangle. The whole idea of this triangle is to connect the idea that we have in our head with the tangible and the name we give it. And the name is then can be multiplied into the different target languages. So for each concept, for each idea that we have, we tend to create a term, and this is what goes into a term-based entry. Or if we look at it, from another aspect, if we look at it from a dictionary versus term-based aspect, then a term, the German term Bank, for example, would in a term-base yield two entries actually. So there would be one entry with the English equivalent bench and one entry with the English equivalent bank. One would be for a credit institute and one would be for a seat in a park or a piece of furniture or something like that. So that brings us back to the metadata field that you want to store with the term-based entry. So if you create a concept like this and you want to differentiate two homonym entries like these two, you would put metadata in place to enable that. Yeah? The dictionary entry is shown in the lower part of this slide. You would have a dictionary that is an alphabetical collection of terms, and you would arrive at the term bank, and then you would find the two meanings in one entry. So that's the difference. So in a lexicon, you will find one term with multiple meanings. In a term base, you will find several entries with the same term for the multiple meanings. So that needs to be understood when you work with term bases. Okay, then sometimes people ask me, well, what do I put into a term base at all? Well, you can put brand or industry-specific terms or even specific terms for a specific customer. You can put acronyms, abbreviations, slogans, preferred or forbidden or confirmed or frequently used terms. You could put everything basically into the term base. And it's actually, for example, recommended that you record also forbidden and outdated terms in order to be able to use the term base to create what we call a corporate language. So where the same term is always used throughout a certain organization or a company, and makes it then a difference in how other companies or other communications, other organizations communicate. So you can form a corporate language using a term base, and that would also mean that you record forbidden and then, using metadata fields, highlight forbidden terms as well. So you tell the user, the consumer of your terminology database, what is allowed and what is not allowed in your company. Okay, so all of that you can put into a term base. And now, after we have basically gone through a little bit of theory, let's go over to the more practical part of the presentation. There are actually three ways to easily create a term base in multi-term. One uses the term base wizard in multi-term itself. One uses the same wizard but initiates from within SDL Charter Studio. And one is using the glossary converter plugin for SDL Charter Studio to create a term base, or glossary converter as such, which is something that I also will show you how that works. So let's go into the first live demo. I will show you how to create a term base first within multi-term and then within Studio, and then using the glossary converter plugin. So let's start with multi-term. Multi-term, if you start it for the first time, is basically an empty shell, right? So you have to create your own term base to use multi-term at all. So otherwise, there is not much use of the application as such. But once you have a term base, you can make use of all the functionality within multi-term to create term-based entries, to import, export, lay out your terminology nicely, and so on and so on. So let's have a look at how that works. So, as I said, multi-term is basically an empty shell. I make the window a little bit bigger so that we see something. Okay, so first thing you have to do is create your own term base. So let's do that. There is this button here on the ribbon, create a term base, but you find the same command also under the file menu new and then create the term base. Once you click there, you are basically brought to the file system where you can specify where to store your term base and how to name the term base file. So I will store my term base here on my desktop so that I can easily delete the data after the webinar, and I will give it a name, something like webinar terms. Yeah? And that will basically already create the SDLTB file on your file system. And now we are going to configure our term base. So we will be greeted by the term base wizard, and we can go step by step through it. There are 4 options here on this screen that you can use. We will now have a look at the first option. So we will create a term base completely from scratch, completely starting with 0. But you could already start with one of the templates that are installed with multi-term, or if you have already a term-based definition file from a previous term base, you could browse to that file and use that as a template. Or if you have already a term base and you want to simply create an empty clone of that term base, you could use the 4th option, browse to the term base file, and then create the term base like this. But let's go through each step one by one, as I promised to do that now. On the next screen, you simply give the term base a friendly name. So a friendly name always means that's how the term base will appear once you open it in SDL Charter Studio or SDL Multiterm. So I will give it maybe the same name as I gave the file name, yeah, for the term base. If you want, you can add more descriptive or copyright data or even a splash screen, a specific one that occurs when you load the term base. Or you could put a reference document with some instructions for your customer and choose a term base icon for that term base. But I won't go into these details. Let's more focus on the structuring of the term base entry and the fields that I will add. So on the next step, which is step number 3 of the wizard, I can choose my languages. Let's choose a few languages now. I will choose German and also English, of course. Maybe French. As I said before, you're not limited in the number of languages you add to a term base. There can be many. Sometimes I've seen term bases with 12, 20 different languages. That's completely normal. Just one thing, if you require in your term base to actually differentiate the regional language codes, yeah, like for example, if you want to put English United Kingdom here instead of English, you can do that as well. Yeah, but I won't do that now. I will use the major language code only, so the main language code. Yeah. Okay, so that is basically your language configuration. You can add languages afterwards, so you can always add new languages to your term base. You can start with a 3-language term base and add more languages later on. That's very easy. So let's move on to the next step. That's the most important one. That's where you define which metadata you want to record with your terms. And what I would always recommend, always recommend, is that you at least have a source field in your term base that allows you to kind of remember where you got that translation or the term itself from. Yeah, because that's very important. After 2 years, you won't know where it was originating from. Next, a data category that I would always think is useful is a node field. A node field can be just a text field to enter any additional information that you want to record with your terms. Also very useful, of course, is a grammatic field, yeah, like a grammar field. A grammar field especially is useful if you do target languages like the Eastern European ones that are completely suffix-based, and you want to remember, is it a feminine or a masculine term? In English, it's not so important. In German, it's of course also very important. Our articles are also, I guess, infamous amongst learners of our, so people who learn our language. The articles are difficult always. So grammar field is certainly helpful. A multimedia field, as I said already, is something that is of course optional, but is nice to have if you put like machinery terms or heavy engineering terms or automotive terms or something like that. Then you can actually show a picture of the part that the term describes. That's nice. You want, if you do serious terminology management, so you actually want to know, is a term confirmed, is it forbidden, is it outdated, is it a new one that has still to be confirmed? Yeah? You would certainly want to have a status field to record these different statuses that a term can have. And if you do it seriously, you would certainly have a definition field, because the terminology science always says no entry without a proper definition. Of course, in real life, you sometimes don't have a definition, or it's difficult to find a good one. Then what you could also do, what you could also provide, is a context sentence. Context sentences are helpful to show how a term is used grammatically within a larger sentence, and often you have a good example that also shows the meaning of the term. Yeah, so or it basically can be used as a replacement for a proper definition. Yeah, so these are typical fields that I always put into a term base if I create one for a customer. Then what I also put often is a subject field that allows you to differentiate different subject areas, or maybe if it's a term base that is used in a company, you would put a department field as well, yeah, so that you know which department is using this term, or which part of the company, yeah, which part of your whole organization is using it. So these are all classifying metadata fields that we can simply create. And now in multi-term, we are able to create different data categories, actually. So we can have a pure text field, like a source field, the nodes field, the definition field, the context sentence. These are pure text fields that you use to simply enter text. And this is also the default data category, data type that multi-term always uses. Yeah, so it's a text field. Means when I add such a field to my entry, what I will see is when I click on it, I will see an empty text box, and I can paste some text or type some text into this field. Now the grammar field, and also the status field, and maybe the subject and department fields. It's much better to not create those as a text field, because sometimes you would put masculine. Then on another day you would put mask dot, or you would simply put m dot or something like that. And then it's always difficult to filter for such content, because you never know what you typed actually. So in this case, multi-term provides so-called pick list fields. So if I change the data type from text to pick list, I'm greeted with this area, and I can simply click into this area, or press the plus button first and then click and add a new pick list item. So I could, for a grammar field, I could put M, then I could put N and F. And since I want the data to be sorted properly alphabetically in my list, I can move the F for feminine upwards and NN. And then probably I also want to remember whether something was an adjective or whether something was an abbreviation, etc. Yeah. If I'm not happy with what I typed here, I can simply click again and change it. Yeah, all the time. As long as the term base is empty, I can also delete these pick list items again, or I can delete also the field as such as long as the term base is empty. But as soon as there are terms in there, these fields are basically not removable anymore. So you better think about how you build it up before you create the term base, because some things you can always add. You can always add to an existing data layout, but you can not so easily remove fields from it once you have data in the term base. So it makes sense to think about these things beforehand. So yes, that should be enough for my grammar field. My multimedia field has a separate data type. It's a multimedia data type. And it basically tells the system that if I want to put something into this field, I'm not allowed to type something, but I get a browse button that allows me to browse to a picture or a sound file or a short video clip. Yeah. So this is behind the multimedia field. Then the status field is again a typical pick list field. So we enter a few categories here. So let's have a few statuses. So let's start with maybe confirmed, maybe new, outdated, or even forbidden, maybe preferred, to again differentiate between two confirmed terms. And yes, that should be it for now. Now let's again sort this list alphabetically. So I can move forbidden up a little bit. And that is what I want. So let's click OK. Definition and context sentence is again a text field. Subject, here you could enter things like, also in the form of a pick list, things like automotive, IT, maybe legal, or HR, human resources, maybe, or let's put some engineering terms. And yeah, I think that's enough. So just to show you how it works. This list can be much longer, of course. And then in the department field, you would probably put things like, this is coming from marketing, or is used by the sales team, or by the customer support, and so on. Yeah. You could even think, I could even think of text types. I could have a text type field with manual, user manual versus website versus marketing brochure versus, you know, what I mean. So there are many ways to add data categories. The decision what makes sense is actually largely depending on what type of content you want to put into the term base. So for now, let's live with these. And on the next step, you actually structure the term base entries. So a term base entry is always divided into 3 levels. we have a entry level. Entry level contains all the information that's relevant for the entry for the whole concept. So what would I put there? I would put, of course, a global note that I want to leave for the whole entry. Maybe also the multimedia field makes sense here, because if you have really a good picture of something, of your concept, then this will be the same picture for all the languages. So you would put this field on the entry level. Maybe also the department and the subject fields are good fields to put here. Oh, that was wrong. Now I see I added the fields as subfields to multimedia. That's not what I want. I remove them again. I make sure that my cursor is on the entry level. So I add them here. Yeah. So this would be my entry level configuration. And then on term level, I certainly record the source of a term and also the status of a term. That is definitely something that goes on term level. Also, the grammar field will be on term level. And of course, the context sentence, the definition, and last but not least, yeah, I think these are, and a note, of course, I can put on term level as well. So I can drag these fields up and down so that they appear in a good sort order here. So that it's always something that I customize, because that depends a little bit how you want to work. I would recommend put the most important stuff up and the less important stuff down. So maybe we put the definition after the grammar field. So the most important one is status, second most is source, and then the other categories. And then press next, and that will create the term base for you. It's now already there, so there is a webinar terms term base. I can add a new entry by simply clicking add new entry, and I get the entry mask, and I could put my first entry. Let's say I want to record the German word for the mouse, and in English that would correlate with mouse. And that's my first term-based entry already. Of course, there is not much information, additional information around it. So maybe I can add a subject field and make this an IT term so that it's clear that it's the IT mouse, not the living mouse, yeah, that I want to describe here. And then maybe a note field where I say, okay, created during the webinar. And here on the term level, I could enter a status. Maybe this is a confirmed term, and the English is also a confirmed term. Like that, and so on. So this is the way I create entries. Let's say I want to easily create a second entry that that I derive basically from this entry. I can easily clone an entry by adding a copy. So you see all the metadata fields are already filled out for me. All I have to provide is the term as such. So I can override the mouse with the word Bildschirm, which is our term for monitor. So the English would be the monitor. And maybe I have an English synonym, that's the screen. And screen is something that shouldn't be used, so I would enter the status field and make it a forbidden one. Yeah, so that's already my second term-based entry. Now, that was creating a term base from within multi-term. Now I show you very quickly where in Studio you can actually create a term base. Well, it's in Studio, everything is on project level, on project template level. So you can either do it in the project template or the project. If I have already a project, I could right-click, go into the project settings of the project, and under language pairs or language pairs, you find the term basis entry. You go there, and you simply choose Create New File-Based Term Base, and ta-da, it opens the same term base wizard that we have just walked through in multi-term. So it's exactly the same thing. Yeah? And it will create the term base in the project folder of this project. If you want to configure a project template, you do the same thing under Setup Project Templates. Here are my project templates. You go into the edit mode for the project template, and you create the term base. Again, in the same properties page under language pairs or language pairs term bases. So the wizard, the multi-term wizard, is available in these two spots or places in SDL Charter Studio as well. What you could also do is you could use the glossary plugin if you have Glossary Converter installed. Glossary Converter is an app that you can find on the SDL App Store. So let's point you to the SDL App Store. That's appstore.sdl.com. That's the URL. And the app that you need is the Glossary Converter app. So you would search for it. Once the website is loaded completely. Now it's completely loaded, so I can search for glossary, and I should find the Glossary Converter, and there is Glossary Converter, and that's the plugin that accompanies Glossary Converter. So you install Glossary Converter and you install the plugin. Once you did that, you get this toolbar into your ribbon in the project view in Studio, and you can simply click Add and configure source target language. This is the location where the glossary will get stored for this project, and you could add fields as well. So you could add a node field here. So it's basically the same as the term-based wizard that multi-term provides, but in a different user interface. And you could simply click OK, and that would create a term base if it would work. At the moment, it doesn't seem to work. So that's a typical bummer if you want to present something. Okay, but I guess this is just a problem with my studio because I install and uninstall so many plugins. So this is not working at the moment for me. But for you, it should work if you download the latest version of the Glossary Converter plugin. Okay, so back into our presentation and on to the next slide. So I already have shown you a little bit of what's on this slide. Basically, I have shown you how to add entries manually and clone entries. So now what I want to show you next is adding a term through an input model, and then I show you the automatic duplicate recognition when you attempt to add a duplicate in multi-term, and then I show you how to easily convert a glossary, an Excel glossary, using Glossary Converter into multi-term. So these are the next few steps in our live demo. So we are doing the live demo again. Let's assume in multi-term you do not want to add all these categories all the time, right? So you would create yourself a formula that fills out most of this metadata automatically for you. And you do that in the term-based management area of multi-term. When I change to this view, I still see my term base, and I also see a dashboard type of representation of my term base. On the dashboard, I see how many terms I have for each language. Yeah, And I can actually have a look at my term-based definition. And if I have a complex definition, I can even print it out and put it side by side with my keyboard, for example, so that I know which data categories I can fill. Now, let's say I want to create an input model that already fills out the subject field, maybe the department field, the status field, maybe the source, because I'm working just on one source at the moment, and also already creates a few of the fields that I need to add data to, or I want to add data to. So I go into the input models area, and I create a new input model. Again, I will be greeted by a wizard. Everything in multi-term is actually wizard-driven. So whenever you create a new input model, maybe, or a new import-export definition, or a new layout, or a new filter, you would always go through the wizard. And the wizard is basically, this one is very short, so it's only 2 or 3 steps. Let's create an input form for German into English, not even covering French now, just for recording terms in these 2 languages. So what I do here is I add the 2 languages under the entry level. And I also add my metadata fields on this level that I want to fill out. And let's see, some of them maybe I already can fill out. For example, maybe I work now, I collect terminology for the marketing department with a subject from IT, with IT terms. So I could fill out these fields automatically. I could even make them read-only so that I'm not going to overwrite the information, yeah, by chance. Or I don't want a user to overwrite this information if I create the input model for a different user. The multimedia field and the node field I leave empty for now. Under the terms, I add a status field, of course. I want the user to fill this out, and I want to provide new as the default value. Yeah. So if I want this to be always filled out, I make it a mandatory field, and I already provide a value. And I do the same for English. So basically, I also add status with value new and make it mandatory. And then for German, I maybe add the source field, and I can already fill in, let's say, webinar terms. Maybe I note down, that should be sufficient. Usually you would put maybe a web address or something like that, that is clickable then inside multi-term, so you can easily find these things and jump to the correct source. I do the same for English. And then I add also the grammar, the definition, the context sentence, and the node field. And I do the same for English. Now, if you look closely, I made a mistake here. So I first added node and then added context sentence. I can easily correct that by dragging and dropping the field. So you see it changed it. And it probably also makes sense here to resort the list of fields so that it's, again, going from more important to less important. The source field doesn't want to behave like I want it. So you can see I can sort these lists with a little bit of dragging and dropping data categories. I try the same here, so I move the status up. Then let's move node down, source up. I let go too early, it gives me an error message, and so on. I don't make sure they are all nicely sorted now. This is something that you want to have a look at, but for now I don't take the time because our time is limited. So again, let's go through them. Status, grammar, source is definitely also something you want as an important category. Let's put definition up a little bit. Yeah, like that. So that's the same on both sides. Okay, so let's go. And that gives me my first input model. It's a little bit of clicking, but it makes, it pays back in the end, because if I now choose my flags layout, I can select my input model. And I can add a new term and see what happens. It fills out all these categories already for me. And now all I have to do is enter my term, like Tastatur. And the English would be keyboard. And for German, I want to record the grammar. So Tastatur is feminine. So I record feminine as well. And maybe I already can set this to be a confirmed term. And then I save the entry. Now let's assume your term base has grown and you don't have just 3 entries in the term base, but many, many, many entries. And you want to add a new term that you may already have recorded, like mouse, for example. Have a look what happens if I hit the Enter key. Multiterm tells me that this entry already exists. And if I want, I can merge the entry. And yes, I want to merge the entry and have a look. Ah, yes, okay, mouse is already there, and I don't have to enter it again. So I can simply cancel editing there, and I have avoided a duplicate entry. This is what the duplicate search is good for when you actually create multi-term entries. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you before moving on in the slide is how to easily import categories or import data into multi-term. You do that most easiest, you do it via glossary converter. Glossary converter, as I said, can be downloaded from the App Store from SDL, and it's a free application. You can simply use it. It's actually a shareware, so you can donate, or you can also use it without donating. It takes a little bit to start on my system. So here you get the prompt to donate. If you want, you can donate. I donated already, so I can simply proceed. Well, the glossary converter is an application that was originally designed to make it easy to convert glossaries. I show you one glossary, maybe this one, English-German. So here you see a typical glossary as it may exist, or you may probably get this type of glossaries from your customers. Actually, normally what you get is simply a naked word list. Yeah, that's the most common case. So there isn't even a headline like this, or already a subject or a status field, yeah, in there. So maybe your glossary looks like this, even. So that would also be a glossary, but a very reduced one, right? So if you get something like this, you may want to add metadata that you already know. So maybe you know that this comes from a subject field called consumer electronics. And you may already know the status because the list comes from your customer. So all the terms in this list are confirmed, yeah, by the customer. So this is something you can add. Or you can add the source field here. Yeah. Maybe customer glossary as your source. And you can then duplicate this information also for the target language easily. Yeah, like this. So you can build a really nice term base already in Excel before you actually convert it to multi-term. So you simply save the file after you edited it that way. And now you can simply drag and drop it to the UI of Glossary Converter. And Glossary Converter will have a look at the file, and it will have a look especially into the first line of the file, so the first row actually in the Excel file, and it will tell you, well, English and German I know already, yeah, but subject, source, and status I do not know yet what that is, so I need to tell the system what it is. So I say, okay, the subject is actually an entry-level field, and it's not a text field, it's a pick list, a typical pick list field, and it could have consumer electronics. Make sure to type this exactly like in the glossary. I open it again in Excel, because a typo here would make the mapping go wrong, and then you end up with funny results. So make sure that this fits. And the source field would be a term level text field, and the status field again would be a term level pick list field. And we might have new, confirmed, forbidden here again, yeah? Just like in our manually created term base. Okay. So, and then I will get an error message now because Excel is trying to access the XLSX file. Now, I have already created my term base. You see, it was quick, and it now imports the data into my term base. So, and once it's finished, the term base is ready to be used in multi-term or in Studio. So let's have a look at the term base in multi-term. So I open it. Oh, that's Studio. Need to open multi-term. Let's open the term base. So I go and browse. And you see Glossary Converter created the term base in the same folder that contained the original glossary. So I can simply copy that path over into that window, and I find my term base here. So let's have a look at that term base now. So this is how it looks like. Consumer electronics as a subject field has been created. My customer glossary source is there. My confirmed category is there. So everything from the glossary has been imported into multi-term. Okay, and last but not least, if we go back into the presentation, in the last few minutes, I want to show you how to use the term base then once you add it to a real project, to a translation project. So you can use the term base as an auto-suggest provider in your project. So you start typing a target term, and it will simply show up in the quick list in Studio. You can use the terminology checker to check against wrong usage of terminology. And you can, of course, use it to add entries on the fly during translation and to visualize forbidden and not forbidden data. I show you quickly how that is done. For that, I have already my project here, and if I enter the project settings, I can now add a term base that I created beforehand. So I can simply use my maybe my sample term base from my system. Folder, this one, and add it to my project. So now it's added to the project. Once the term base is added to the project, I can again enter the project settings and go to the verification options and actually check what the terminology verification can do for me. So I could check for target terms that are not found in the term base, even though the source term has been found. So I want this to use the same target term. And I can actually check for the status and make sure that I'm not using any forbidden terms. Yeah? So let's try that. So let's open one of the sample files. I guess the infamous sample photo printer document is the best sample because I can show most of it just within 2 or 3 segments. So let's open that one for now. You see a few segments have already been translated, but the 4th one hasn't been translated yet. So I put my cursor into that field, and you see I already see my term base entry here in the term recognition area in Studio. If I want for that entry, and for all entries that are shown later on in this area, I can actually make my metadata fields visible by selecting them. And then maybe once you want that, you don't want this very bright gray font here, gray font color here. You may want a darker one to make it easier to read, or at least I always want to do that. I'm not sure the silver here is very light color. I make it black so I can easily see what value is there. So let's assume I want to have a look at the term base entry. Then I can go there and have a look. You see there is actually a forbidden source term in here, but no forbidden target term yet. So I enter one for now so that we actually have a forbidden one. So I add a new term. And I'm using the old German spelling that I still learned in school. So for me, this was still correct, and I got a mistake. Would I write it differently? But now it's not correct anymore. So I want to warn myself. So I put the wrong term into the term base as well. And now have a look what happens if I look up the term again. You see now the approved and forbidden status values are shown as well, and that makes sure that I am not using the wrong term here. Should I still use the wrong term, like for example when I translate lassen Sie 12 Zentimeter Abstand auf der Rückseite des. And now you see I type the F character, which would give me the first variant, which is the correct one. But maybe I'm so used to the old writing, it would still give me or provide me with the wrong term. And if I confirm this, the system just allows me to do that. But once I confirm the segment, I get a warning, and the message says, okay, I used the wrong term in this translation. Yeah. So maybe I want to add clearance and the German Abstand to my term base. I can add the term by clicking Add New Term, and it would add my term, and I could still put more information here, like a status field and my subject, and then save the entry. So that's a way you could work with that feature. Or let's say I want to put paper and pr10 into the term base as well. If you do not want to record the metadata, the additional metadata, you could also simply click the quick Add New Term, and that would add it on the fly, and it would show up directly here in the term recognition window. And that basically concludes my presentation.